Thank you all for joining me again for Kingdom Tales. This summer, we're gathering together online so that we can read a book. Actually, it's a series of books, and the book that we're reading right now is book 1 in the series. It's called Kingdom Tales by David and Karen Maines. You know, for us at St. Aidan's, Easter just came to an end. For us, Easter is 50 days long. But when we think about Easter, probably the first thing that you think about is Easter egg hunts, where you go out into the yard and you look all around for the eggs that the adults have hidden here and hidden there. And you gather up all of the eggs that you can find, but every single year there's 1 or 2 eggs that nobody has been able to discover. And usually the grown-ups know where they are, and they stand back and they go, oh, you're getting hot or you're getting cold. And it can be really fun looking for them, but sometimes it's really frustrating because they know where they are and they won't tell us where those eggs are hidden. But how much fun is it when we look really, really hard and then we find that egg that was where we never knew to look? Did you know that when Jesus was talking about his kingdom, he talked about it as a gift or a treasure that was hidden somewhere. And he said that if you find his kingdom, that you should move there, that you should live there, that you should do whatever it takes to live with him in his kingdom when you find it. Today's story is a story all about seeking for things and finding the things that we're looking for. This is Sighting Day. The subjects of the kingdom worked hard, keeping Great Park beautiful. Some were gardeners, some were foresters, some were vine dressers, some were experts in animal husbandry, some were guides for strangers, some were healers. But no matter how hard they worked, they loved to play. The game the children played best was Seek the King. "I saw the king!" exclaimed Amanda as she burst breathlessly into Mercy's cottage. 2 little red foxes came bounding through the door right after her, bumping into one another. "I saw the king on sighting day," she repeated, proud of her success. "How wonderful," replied Mercy, who had just walked, man who sat like stone, to a chair by the window where the sun shone in. Once seated, the man didn't move. He didn't turn his head. He didn't say a word. Mercy said he must have experienced some awful grief in his life. Hero's little brother often crawled into the man's lap and patted his cheek, but still he didn't move. In a way, they were 2 of a kind. Little Child never said a word, and the man never laughed. Often, the 2 sat quietly together in the sunshine. "Sighting Day means the king takes time to play," Amanda said, turning to explain to Hero, who was still too cautious for the lively girl. "The children try to find the king all over Great Park on Sighting Day. It's a huge game of Seek the King. He appears in disguises, and once a child makes a sighting, he gets to go to the practice field where the king and all of the children play for the rest of the afternoon." "Why don't you try to sight the king, Hero?" said Mercy. Hero shook his head no. So Amanda bounded out of the door without him. She laughed as she ran, and the boy watched the foxes gambling at her heel down the path toward Wildflower Woods. It was no use. He would never sight the king. Every time someone had whispered, "There's the king," Hero had only seen a beggar or a woodcutter or a gardener, never a king. Mercy said this was because he didn't believe in a king. "You have to believe," she always explained, "in order to see." That didn't make any sense to Hero. The enchanter had said the opposite. Seeing is believing. It was all well and good for everyone else in Great Park to talk about a king, but how was Hero to know that they weren't playing a game with him or pretending? At any rate, he wasn't in the mood for such games today. Mercy had said that a friend of hers was coming this morning to look at his brother. Something was wrong with little child. Mercy said he was too old to be unable to speak, and that all normal children were full of laughter. Something must have stunned this little one, something that knocked the words and the laughter from him. Hero knew it was the enchanted city. Its sour odor sat upon their hearts. He remembered the burners igniting the bier at his mother's funeral. He saw again the stricken look in his brother's eyes. Now the younger boy could no longer laugh, and the older would not play games. Watching his brother sit quietly in the still man's lap, Hero wondered, did Mercy's friend also know what to do for a boy whose scar went deeper than his skin? Hero thought he heard someone call, "Siding!" But instead of the king, a peasant stepped through the cottage. He was wearing a collarless shirt and worn breeches. His hair curled beneath an old brimmed hat, which he hung beside the door. He banged cheerfully on the doorpost and called, "Where's my friend?" Hero thought he meant Mercy, but instead, the old woman pointed to Little Child sitting by the window. "Here he is," she said. "Here is your friend." The peasant laughed. "I thought my friend would like to go with me today. We can go watch the sun make the grapes fat, or we could listen to bees singing in the flower garden, or we could race the ducks across the duck pond." He produced a birch bark boat with tiny sails and small acorn people. The man handed the toy to the child, who took it carefully. Then suddenly the peasant did a flip and then started walking around the room on his hands. Hero gasped in surprise, and Mercy laughed. The peasant walked to the door, his feet waving in the air. "Come on, my friend, let's go see the ducks." To their amazement, Hero's brother climbed down from the still man's lap. Mercy handed the child the peasant's hat, and he followed the upside-down figure out of the door and down the path. Hero thought he heard the beginnings of a boy's chuckle. Hero stayed in the cottage all morning. In a way, he wished the peasant had asked him to go along. He chopped wood for the fireplace, careful not to get too close to the fire. He fed the pigs. He helped Mercy care for man who sat like stone. He swept the floor. Early in the afternoon, a young man returned, carrying Hero's brother, asleep in his arms. The little boy's thumb was in his mouth. There were berry stains on his cheek and his chin. "Well, we had quite a morning," said the young man after Little Child had been placed in bed. Hero and the man sat at the table waiting as Mercy poured cold juice from a stoneware pitcher. "Where did the peasant go?" Hero asked. The young man smiled. "To find the king. It's sighting day, you know. Say, have you ever heard a bee chorus? We did. It was amazing. They buzz in harmony. There was one old drone who was off tune, but the queen quieted him real quick." Mercy laughed. "Then we raced boats. There were 50 ducks and 50 boats and hundreds of children. The ducks won, but our boat came in second." The young man looked around and then spoke behind his hand. "Your brother and I blew really hard into the sails." Hero didn't know whether to believe him or not. "And oh, yes, we watched the grapes grow." He motioned to a bowl of fruit on the table. Hero had thought they were plums, but now he noticed that they were huge grapes plucked off the stem. We watched a little bit too long. I was telling a story. Sorry, but they're still really good. Try one." Hero reached over and bit into a grape. It was luscious. He scratched his head. How had the grape grown so large? The young man was still talking, and you'll be glad to know, your little brother laughed. He loved seeing people walk on their hands. He rubbed his arms and his shoulders. And little child talked. He said, "I see the king." Mercy was sitting at the table with them. "Most appropriate," she said, "for sighting day, don't you think?" With that, she got up, walked over, and planted a kiss on the young man's forehead. "I knew you could help him. Thank you for your time." Hero looked at Mercy. Who was this young man? What had happened to the peasant? "Don't mention it," said the young man. "It was wonderful fun. Now I'm going to the practice field. The children are all waiting there. You come too, Hero. This is one of the best days there is." And Hero soon discovered that the young man was right. Sighting day was great fun. The man organized games and competitions. There were three-legged races and pole vaulting and hide and seek and human pyramids and walking the log. Hero found himself drawn into the middle of all the joyful clamor. He discovered that no place was more fun than the place where the young man was. The man taught them all to walk on their hands. The children struggled to perform the feat. Their elbows collapsed. Their legs refused to stay straight above their heads. Their feet tilted over too far. Oh, and down they fell. Everyone was laughing. "See," said the young man to Hero, "this exercise is great for making unhappy children laugh." The young man juggled with the clown juggler. They almost dropped oranges and almost bungled the throws and almost missed catching the falling objects. And all the children laughed and clapped and cheered. And everyone shared jump ropes and balls and marbles, and no one was left out of the games, and no one was chosen last. The play ended when all the hot, sweaty children traipsed to Lake Marmo, where they plunged into the cool water and splashed and dunked the young man, who splashed and dunked each one of them back. Hero had to admit that it had been a wonderful afternoon. Games were not so bad after all. By the time the young man walked back to Mercy's cottage with Hero, Little Child was eating his supper. "I see the king!" he shouted, and ran to greet his friend. These words were the first Hero had ever heard his brother speak. The older boy's eyes suddenly felt moist, and he turned to the young man and choked out, "Thank you." Mercy served them the grapes that were so big they made you laugh just to look at them, with some bread and some cheese. Hero took a bite of the fruit and thought he had never tasted anything so good. "I see the king," said Little Child, smiling and playing peekaboo with his pudgy hands. "Do you think he really saw the king?" said Hero. Mercy looked at the young man with a question in her eyes. Quietly, he bent and tousled Hero's hair. "Your brother can see the king because he's a little child, and little children play the game best of all. The others see the king because they believe, and they've been given the gift of seeing here in the park. Believing comes before seeing." "But will I ever see the king?" asked Hero. "Do you believe in the king?" asked the young man. "I don't know. I think maybe, but if I could only see." "Well, someday you might," said the young man. He plucked another giant grape from the bowl and handed it to the boy. That evening, after everyone in Caretaker's cottage was quiet, the caretaker took Hero to Outcast Village. As they walked, the soft jingling of the tools in the man's pockets made a comforting sound in the dark. Caretaker explained that on sighting day, many outcasts were unable to play the game of Hunt the King. Some were wounded, some were blinded, some were mending from diseases. Instead, the king came to them. He sang songs and told stories. He wove moonlight and the warm night and all good things, all together, until the hearts of the outcasts were comforted because the king had been among them. Unfortunately, Hero was too far away to see the king. There were too many people crowded around him. The night was too full of shadows, but he heard a man's voice lifted into the sweet night air, and then all the people sang along. Soon that song ended and another began. And the boy felt strangely peaceful and thought that the ugly burn on his face might not really be so important. Someone began to walk among the people. Hero could see a form moving closer to him. Stopping, talking to each outcast, he hoped it would be the king. Hero peered into the night. It was only a beggar. The man was wearing a brown cloak and a hood. Hero, the beggar asked. Hero, don't you know me? Hero wanted to say, you're nothing but a beggar, but something in the man's voice stopped him. You must see me with your brother's eyes, the beggar said. You must see me as he sees me. The beggar took off his hood and set his cloak aside. Hero tried to see him with his brother's eyes, his brother who had sighted the king, and then, it was the peasant who had come into the cottage that morning and carried little child off. Hero, said the peasant, can you do this? He sprang onto his hands and balanced his feet in the air as he moved across the grass. Hero hadn't spent all afternoon at the practice field for nothing. He lifted his hands into the air and then went down to the ground with his feet in the air. He walked around awkwardly until he faced the peasant. They looked at each other upside down. The peasant now wore the face of the young man. Hero began to laugh. Yes, he said just before he lost his balance and tumbled to the ground. You're the young man. And suddenly, it all came together. Hero understood this was the king. This beggar, this peasant, this athletic young man here was the one who had made his brother laugh and helped him to speak. This was the one who had poured joy into Hero's heart and taught him that games were fun. The king sat on the grass beside Hero. The sovereign was laughing. So was caretaker. Hero could hear him jingling and chiming. This is the king, said the old man. I know, said Hero. He rose to his feet, flipped to his hands, walked awkwardly with his feet in the air, balancing, tipping, and then righting himself. And then he faced the men. He said, I see the king. And he did. And so the boy discovered that Seek the King is a wonderful game. Like all games, it must be played with a child's heart, which believes and is always prepared for surprises, because a king can wear many disguises.